Obviously, Kara's character is obviously an NHS worker, and I wanted to get your perspective on what it's like to be, say, on the front lines of COVID-19, even pre-COVID, when it comes to living under austerity and having, NHS assets and being stripped away and the media constantly against you. But I say, I'm only seeing, that's only my perspective. I'm not actually out there on the ground doing the work. So I wanted to get your perspective, especially as you told a bit of a story on the initial post.
Yeah, well, thank you. Slight disclaimer, I'll just say on here, I've already messaged it to you, but I'm not a nurse. I work as a healthcare technician, as a band 2. Nurses are band 5 and above. And I've only been working in the NHS in my role for a year and a half, thereabouts, so just over. But it did manage to coincide with the COVID pandemic, which was great timing on my behalf, I think. But yes, there is a lot of praising of the NHS and what we do, and oh, isn't it fantastic? And all these people doing these wonderful things, which yes, it is. And I didn't personally, because of a health condition that made me clinically vulnerable, go on the front line in terms of on the wards. However, a lot of my colleagues did. And as you say, yes, before COVID, there were issues. After COVID, there's even more issues. And during the pandemic, I was working and providing emergency appointments for eye care, basically. And we did see a lot of people sort of not coming in with things like bleach in their eye for like 3 days or a week or something. And then they'd lose the eyesight because they were so scared of coming into the hospital and getting COVID. Wow. We also obviously were overlooked for PPE, as with a lot of people, because we weren't on the wards. But we were, if you're on the wards, you were in PPE, in theory, or at least the doctors were. A lot of the nurses weren't necessarily in PPE. In the early days, they had minimal PPE. Even when we were supposed to all be wearing PPE, we ran out of PPE. So a lot of the staff from my ward who then went on the wards had to go and or come back to our ward just to get the PPE that we had going spare, so that they didn't have to see patients without any protection. They were told, like, okay, if you're brushing someone's teeth who has COVID, then you only need to wear minimal PPE. Now, clearly not a good idea. And it was a bit of a shambles, a lot of a shambles. And we're still feeling the effects of that for sure. We had staff leave. I know a lot of other departments had staff leave. And just people aren't being replaced, despite the fact we're supposed to be getting up to normal staffing levels, or not normal staffing levels, normal patient seeing levels again. So the last couple of days, I've done shifts where I've been the only technician working the cameras on the department. And the doctors will say, well, why haven't you seen my patient yet? And it's like, well, because there's 5 or 6 of you who are each seeing 8 patients now. And I have to do sort of the camera work and the diagnostic work for almost every single patient. And I don't have any support. So it's, I think the individuals who work in the NHS do care about the NHS. But there is a huge disconnect between the business departments, the funding departments, the people who are up at the top, and even on a smaller scale on the top of individual departments that then just don't actually realise how challenging it can be to try and actually keep everything running. And it's like, well, why can't you do this? Because there's not enough hours in the day. So, yeah, and then they go, oh, I feel really sorry for this person. It's like referring to you or another person. It's like, well, yeah, but do you want to actually help us at all? Or, hire more staff or raise it? And there are a couple of doctors who do, but some who don't. And yeah, you can see how, I think because I'm new, I've gone in with all the like, oh yeah, the NHS is fantastic. And it is, don't get me wrong, it is. But definitely you can quickly see how people become very, very jaded and very, very, I'll have days when I think, why am I doing this? Like, just why? But it's, yeah, there's such a guilt complex as well with people who will say, patients will come in and say, oh, you do a fantastic job, well done, thank you for everything you do. And you feel guilty because, like I said, I didn't go on the wards. I was still providing a service. I'm still providing a service now because people say, and I will say to patients, well, I didn't go on the wards, but other people didn't. Most people will still say, well, you're still doing a fantastic job. You've still worked through it. And others will go, oh, why? You're young. Why didn't you go on the wards? Okay, now I'm being attacked.
Oh my
Thank
God.
you. Please leave.
It sounds like you can't win there. Like, I mean,
No.
you mentioned, you say before, like you wonder why there are sometimes days where you wonder why you're doing this because it's like too much stress and you know, sense of ungratefulness from some people. Was there any specific instance any specific instance where you can recall that sort of rammed that particular feeling home?
Yes. So there was an instance where a patient had said, oh, thank you so much for everything you do. And how was it on the wards during COVID and that kind of thing? And I said, well, I didn't go on the wards. My colleagues did go on the wards. And I think my stance has changed a little bit from being a bit like, oh, well, you know, I didn't contribute in that way. But I've kind of gone, well, I did contribute in other ways. And that hasn't meant that it's been any less challenging, I guess, throughout COVID. But most people will say, oh, you know, well done, you're still doing a great job. And other people, like I say, maybe two patients have gone, oh, well, why weren't you on the wards? It's like, okay, what were you doing during COVID? So, yeah, I think we just avoid that topic now if patients bring it up. But I think another thing is watching other people go through stuff as well. So I think I've mentioned my friend's story working on a paediatric ward where at one point she said it was nicknamed the heaven and hell ward because you were either going up or you were going down. Like, that was it. And that wasn't nicknamed by her. That wasn't nicknamed by the nurses on that ward. That was like people high up would jokingly refer to it as the heaven and hell ward, which is incredibly insensitive when you think that there's both adults and children on that ward who were either doing really well and about to go home, or they were doing really badly and being expected not to be long on the world, long for this world. So it's, yeah, I think there is definitely a sense in the NHS of camaraderie, but almost in the same way that camaraderie works in the army, of you're doing it for your colleagues, you're doing it for the people you work with, you are doing it for the patients as well. But when it comes to you're not doing it for the NHS, which is a weird thing to say because you're working for the NHS.
Yeah.
You join for the NHS, the ideals of the NHS. Actually, Benji, what are you doing? Sorry, the dog's just jumped on a ball and scared himself. You're turning up every day when you're knackered, when you're short-staffed, because, you know, if you don't turn up, then your friend's going to have to do the long shift, or someone who doesn't want to be doing 5 different jobs is going to have to do 5 different jobs because you can't do 2 of those jobs because you're not there. So there's definitely a bit of a martyr complex that is almost fostered in the NHS, which again doesn't help when it's like, oh, clap for the NHS, which when the very first clap was very moving, and everyone that I worked with, we have a group chat and we were all on it saying, you know, oh, well done guys, we were all out there with our pots and pans or claps or whatever, and we were all like quite moved to tears. But as it went on, it just became oh, fantastic, look at these people. And it's a bit of a joke now, and I don't really say that lightly. It's kind of like, well, look at this national support, again, from the government, from the institutions. But where's the action then that says, okay, well, let's pour more money into social services, into care, into not letting people get into these situations in the first place.
Would I be right in saying the meaning is certainly diluted, and without any accompanying actual real-world action, it amounts to nothing more than just empty gesturing and a sort of excuse not to actually take any action, especially when you look at as you say, the number of people now leaving the NHS because the work conditions are so poor, and you know, for
Yeah,
example,
absolutely.
not giving nurses a pay rise in line with inflation, and not restoring the nurses bursary, not giving NHS staff parking. As I say, the pay rise that was given to NHS workers wasn't in line with inflation, so it amounts to a pay cut. So I say that I do mention in the song about the sort of the doorstep clapping is kind of part of the same empty gesturing alongside the flag waving we keep seeing from both the mainstream parties.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like an empty gesture, you know, in lieu of any actual change. And there's kind of an interesting parallel there when you said that some of the higher up people in the management at the NHS are obviously somewhat aloof and disconnected from the actual people on the ground doing the real work. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. Even within where I work, we have a management team who are paid a lot more than the nurses. If you go onto a management track, you're immediately in a higher sort of banding. It's all about banding. I don't think the doctors work on a banding system, but certainly most other careers in the NHS or career paths work on a banding system. And our management track is supposed to be a business group that fund us and decide where the money goes. They also are in charge of making sure that targets are met, and targets and money are necessary evils. However, they're definitely evils because you'll have people who don't understand, but because they need to meet a target, they'll book patients in inappropriately or under the wrong consultant,
Yeah.
or and when people complain, you'll get an answer back of, well, they've seen a doctor, they've had an appointment. What are you complaining about? But they couldn't be seen by that doctor because the doctor sent them away because it's not the right doctor for them to see. So then they're back to the back of the queue, or they're being re-referred or discharged when they actually need to be seen. So it's this really disconnected environment of people on the ground and people making decisions. I think also because we might see one person in management when they come down to apologise for something or sort something out or attend a meeting, they don't know our faces. There's definitely been incidents where people have felt really bullied, actually, by higher up management. And then because the person who has acted in this way doesn't know who you are, despite the fact they've almost victimised you,
Yeah.
they'll come around showing a new person around or a new director around or something, and they'll go, "Oh, hi, how are you?" It's like, I don't want to talk to you, but I have to smile and wave. It's very disconnected. And I can understand that people who work on the ground treating patients don't want to work in management. So it's challenging to get a combination of the two. But yeah, it just doesn't work. And I think some people get very complacent in their jobs and their job roles, and they get away with things because that's how it's been done for years,
Yeah.
in both on the ground and in high management. But it just shouldn't be that way.
Exactly. I was gonna do a not so much a hot take, but I wanted to draw a couple of interesting parallels here. In that, I think when you say that the people actually on the ground doing the important work that in the NHS's case is obviously is saving lives, but obviously there's plenty of other key workers involved as well. Obviously, Cara, who actually played the NHS worker in the video, she's a vet. And that's
Yeah,
still considered a key worker. People still need their pets looking after. You've got the people who run the bin lorries. You've got the people who work in the supermarkets. There's so many people out there that are essential workers during the pandemic, but are still,
that for the NHS. Yeah, definitely.
and there's
Yeah.
again the people who manage and are in charge of them. It's quite sad that increasingly we see that people in management positions haven't actually been on the ground, haven't actually done the work, and they're only I know this may be seen tarring people with the same brush here, but the only inverted commas in skill they have is in delegating people. And many people lifted up into those management roles have only ever done that sort of thing through sort of nepotism. Like, so,
Yeah.
oh, I've got this management role because I know the owner or I know the manager. Like, and I know that it's not all that case. You know, you do get plenty of people in managerial positions who've worked their way up from the bottom and know what it's like. But I think that's very much something that we find in common in almost all industries. Now, the interesting parallel I wanted to draw here, which might sound like a weird one, but bear with me, between the healthcare service and the music industry, believe it or not, because people join up to the NHS because they really care about it. They believe in a system that's free at the point of use. They love making people better and feeling like they're contributing to a better world. You know, it's not just about, obviously, you know, people want to afford to live and stuff. And you know, there's always that incentive whereby, you know, you have to work, otherwise you starve, of course. But with health workers, obviously, there is that extra layer of, you know, I'm doing something, I love doing this because I'm contributing to, you know, helping save people. I'm passionate about it. So, and when it comes to musicians and artists, we obviously do what we love because we love it. We always adapt. You know, obviously we've been crushed during this pandemic, and we're obviously trying to always find ways, forcing ourselves to adapt to ever-changing circumstances where our main source of revenue has been completely blindsided. And even pre-pandemic, to be fair, most musicians are over a barrel because they keep doing what they love, because regardless of worsening circumstances, because they love it and they're passionate about it. And say the parallel I want to draw there is because both health workers and musicians, and I'm sure there's some other industries we could think of or services we could think of where certain people in certain professions who do it because they love it are often shafted by those who have the decision-making power because they love it so much, and are sort of, it is easier to sort of worsen those conditions.
People's goodwill.
That's it. So like, oh, don't worry, we can make the working conditions worse. We can keep pushing for more productivity and more worth out of these people because they love it. So it's like that sort of good nature and that passion gets taken advantage of more than, for example, somebody who is doing a minimum wage job that they're doing just to survive. You know, oh, I'm really passionate about data entry or shelf stacking. You know, obviously those are still essential jobs, but there isn't that extra layer of, you know, I'm really passionate about this work. And so, as well as there obviously being that need to survive, which every sort of working class person has to navigate with regards to their relationship to the people above them, making the decisions who don't necessarily know what it's like to work in that job. With some professions have that extra layer of, okay, yeah, I need to survive, but also I absolutely love this job and I love doing what I do. And so it then gives those people above them another extra excuse to sort of keep pushing for more productivity, worsen conditions to make it better for them, for they get more productivity out of it and more sort of creaming off their own like slice of the pie. While, as I say, using the fact that because those workers are so personally invested in the role, that they can just squeeze a bit more out of them. And I think, not speaking both as a performing musician, in terms of like a wedding singer, and also as an artist that's trying to make a living through original music, the streaming services the deals for us just get worse and worse and worse because they know we will still keep making music, that we won't stop because we love doing it. Like, what if they're going to still keep making it and they're still going to find ways to adapt? You know, let's just keep pushing. We can get more and more out of them because they're never going to stop. Sorry, a bit of a long-winded one that one, but I hope you see where I'm coming from.
I agree. I do, and I could see where you were coming from even before you sort of started and launched into the political side of it. But I think, in particular, this pandemic has shown, and here's a parallel that you'll find interesting, that people need entertainment and they need a creative outlet. And actually, what was one of the very sad things that, like I said, I didn't go on the wards, but I heard my colleagues' experiences on the wards, where people were not allowed anything because If you were on a COVID ward, you couldn't take anything in with you. You couldn't take anything out with you. And if someone died or if they left, everything was burnt because a bit like, well, very much like the plague in London, you didn't want anything to spread. So you don't know what's contaminated. They didn't know in the early days how long they had to quarantine things for, what could kill the virus and what couldn't. So that meant that a lot of people didn't have anything to live for. They didn't have their phone. They didn't have a tablet. They didn't have TV. They didn't have radio. They had nothing. And if you're ill with COVID, it can be quite quick. But if you're in hospital, it could take a long time for you to get better. If you're not surrounded by any stimulation whatsoever, you die. You mentally die because there's nothing to live for. And that was something that definitely happened at my trust, or at least that my colleagues have described happening at my trust. And then when you've got the prospect as well of you feel awful because you can't breathe, and then you can't see your family either. You can't phone them. You can maybe phone them once or twice a day, but if you're really ill, you can't actually make that phone call. And you know that if you die, you may never see them again. That may be the last time that you saw your partner or your children. And that's a horrific thing to have going on in your head when you're feeling awful and you've got no distraction. And I think that has been a big thing that we've all forgotten about, is the distraction that we found in entertainment, in music, in radio, in films. It gives us something to, I guess, a form of escapism. It gives us something to think, remove ourselves from a situation. And if you don't have that, and that's terrifying and mentally just horrific for people to go through, particularly, I know some of my colleagues were on a ward where I think he was about 40, but there was a 40-year-old man who unfortunately did die of COVID, and he was, by the sounds of it, drowning in his own lungs. And he said to them, I think he was only there for like less than a day. He'd come into A&E, said, I'm going to die. You need to phone my fiance. And his fiance didn't get there in time. So that was his last couple of hours on Earth. He had nothing. Couldn't speak to his fiance. He couldn't see her. She was obviously freaking out because she'd got this phone call of, you need to come in because your young, relatively fit partner is dying. So it's just, I know that particular experience has had a massive impact on some of my colleagues who were on that ward and who were dealing with that patient. And I think, to be honest, again, as far as I know, and I can speak for them because I think I would know whether they had been offered support, certainly from the trust, in terms of mental health support, but I'm pretty sure that most of them who've dealt with that situation discussed it between themselves. They might have journaled a bit, but other than that, they don't have time to access counselling. If they needed to access counselling, they would have to go through their GP. I don't think the hospital has run a service. They've run a chaplaincy service, but I don't think anything like the sort of mental health support that people should have after seeing those sorts of things, or being part of most of those things. And a lot of people can say with near certainty have just pushed stuff to the back of their minds.
Yeah.
And those will come out in the future because that's what happens. But in the moment, you just have to get on with it. And that's what they've done. But I don't think they've been supported in dealing with those issues in a healthy way at all.
It is, I hadn't even considered what you said there about, when you're on the COVID ward, you've got no access to the sort of, the things that remind you about, what is great, what's great about, living in this world is the things
Life.
like that. And and I had not even considered that, just having all those things just completely taken away, you are, technically surviving, but like spiritually, I don't loathe to use that word, but like poisoned, like everything that reminds you about what it is, great about being human is like, in the best case circumstances, temporarily completely removed. And yeah, I hadn't even considered that aspect of it, to be fair. There's do you know the YouTuber Vsauce?
No, I don't think so.
Hey, Vsauce, Michael here. Today we're going to learn about blah 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 blah. But he did this one experiment where he isolated himself in a room for a few days. I can't remember how many days it was, but he was like locked in a white room with like enough water and food to survive, and it was only like really plain like protein bars or whatever it was, and fresh water. And he was like, I'm going to be stuck in this room with no skylight. I don't know what time, no clock, nothing to occupy his thoughts or anything. He was just in this single room for several days, like isolated. And it's really, really interesting because obviously you completely screws with your perception of time, because there's nothing to do. You can't even mark out what the days are. And I suppose in a hospital you do get the idea of like when day and night comes, but that's pretty low bar, you know. In comparison,
Yeah.
like he's saying, when we came out, it's like he had to recover. He needed a couple of weeks to recover and actually stimulate his brain, because like it's like if you don't use like an appliance or a thing or whatever for a while, like for you to bring it back to music, if I don't play this guitar or pick it up for, I don't know, 6 months or whatever, it's when I pick it up again, it's going to be like, oh, horrible, like the strings are all rusted out, you know, the fretboard is dusty and horrible, and maybe the electrics have all gone to pot. You know, if you don't actually pick it up and use it, you know, it decays.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's another mental health angle that I'd not even considered, which ties into actually one of the other characters, which is meant to be a survivor of PTSD anyway, which I imagine is fairly rife at the moment. But
I think
sorry, go on.
I think PTSD will not hit now. I think PTSD will hit in the future, because people are still, I guess, almost in the denial and the repression phase of the things they've seen and the things that they've been part of and witnessed and been asked to do. And then obviously there's a lot of momentum, certainly at the start, a year on, maybe less momentum, but there's still momentum of, you know, we have to get this done. We have to, you know, step up for your country, and all this rhetoric that you get around the Second World Wars and the First World Wars. And I mean, you even look at the vaccine stuff. But I think there will be a lot of mental health problems, unfortunately, from PTSD, but also from just mass anxiety and young people, their livelihoods,
Yeah.
whether they go to uni, whether they don't go to uni, the university experiences that they've had or they feel they haven't had because of COVID. It's just, I can't even get my head around it. I know a couple of teachers who work for, or one of them works for a school that's not a privileged school. And she was saying that they had to arrange so that kids could have, ensure that they had an hour's access a week for their schooling. Because if you've got a household of maybe 5 or 6 kids who are all school age, then who gets the priority? And obviously that would be the ones who are doing their exams and things. So that's, again, what the schools, or certainly her school, was told to prioritise. But for those schools, her partner works at I think it's a grammar school rather than a private school, but either a grammar school or a private school. And those children were having far more contact time, even if it was over Zoom or sort of, they were far more supported than the kids who had to sort of not fight, but, you know, figure out who was going to have that time. And I know, again, we had a meeting a while back that was talking about our sort of paediatric team who deal with children's eye conditions and some adult eye conditions and teenagers' eye conditions, were saying that this they saw they see the occasional case before COVID, but they reckon there's going to be maybe in a year's time, maybe 2 years' time, a lot more teenagers who all of a sudden their brain shuts down and says you can't see anymore. There's no biological reason why they shouldn't be able to see, or why their vision goes double, why their eyes stop working. But the stress response can build up so much that it actually affects you physically, as we know from placebo effects things. But yeah, they were predicting, this particular person who's worked in a job for years, that they'll see far more of these cases because teenagers who have missed out on schooling, who need grades to get into university, who need a grade to get into sixth form or do the job they want, or all sorts of things. It's just mind-blowing to think that all of that can build up and create all of these issues maybe a year in the future, maybe 2 years in the future, maybe 3 years in the future. And I don't think, I'd love to say I think the NHS will be able to be on top of that and support those people, and that will, never come to fruition, but I know it will. And then we're going to have to deal with almost like delayed reactions and delayed responses to something that happened and probably won't even be linked to these conditions coming up in the future. And there'll be, I don't know, maybe a news article or something saying, oh, lots of teenagers going blind. It must be all the time that they spend on video games, or all the time that they spend doing this, or it's because they socialise, or it's because they do this, or it's because they do that. And actually, it's because they haven't got any support, and because they've lived through a really traumatic experience. And yes, COVID is awful. Yes, it has been bad. Yes, things could have been handled better, and things can be put in place in the future, whether they will be or not, to sort out some of the issues that will come to bite the NHS in the backside, basically. But that's future planning. And I always get the feeling that most things, certainly when it comes to governments, when it comes to funding, tend to be very short term because they want to get re-elected. They're not thinking about the next 10 years, even though they'll release a 10-year plan.
Indeed.
5-point plan.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Have a PowerPoint.
Yeah, it feel like as we say, that sort of nepotism and cronyism extends all the way up to like the biggest halls of power, really, whereby this is certainly applicable to most political parties. But when it comes to the Conservatives in particular, it's pretty common knowledge now that if you donate to the Conservative Party pre an election, you will receive dividends much later on with a lucrative government contract, regardless of your expertise or experience in that field, which links into what you were on about with PPE before, like these companies being given contracts for PPE that have never even touched such an area of industry before. Same goes with the ferries and stuff like that.
Ventilators,
yeah. Oh my god. So are there any staff that obviously you don't want to name them or anything, that are particularly struggling? I know we obviously get these horror stories of nurses using food banks, which is obviously an appalling thing to have to sort of get your head around. Have you any personal experience of anybody that in the profession has reached that sort of level of destitution, as it were?
I think a lot of people who end up in those sorts of situations wouldn't necessarily speak about them openly. However, I do know of friends of mine and colleagues who work in the NHS who have had surgeries that they've needed pushed back and back and back, because despite the fact that they've had to go to A&E several times with major issues, these surgeries have still counted as elective rather than emergency surgeries. And these people have had to take a lot of time off of work, to the extent that they're probably no longer receiving sick pay, although I don't know if that's the case or not. and they still can't work because they haven't had these surgeries. They keep having these relapses. They've had to sort of come in and try and work, but then every time they try and work, because everybody else goes, oh, thank God there's someone back, like we can use some of our time owing, we can have a different day off, then a lot of work falls onto someone who's already ill and already struggling, and then they have to take more time off. So there's definitely a bit of a snowball that turns into an avalanche very quickly. But even pre-COVID, a colleague of mine, she was working in, I want to say emergencies, no, it was ICU, and she has 4 children. So this is a while back. This is quite a long time ago, very much pre-COVID. So her 4 children are now all adults, but she'd remarried. She had twins with her second husband, and she was working on ICU at the time. And a call came in saying, "Oh, someone's husband's coming into ICU." And everyone went, "Oh God, whose is it?" And it turned out it was her husband with a brain tumor that had ruptured, and so she was working on shift in the department where her husband was rushed into hospital and subsequently passed away a couple of days later.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I know she's a good friend of mine. When she's spoken to me about it, she says she doesn't cope. And obviously, nobody could be expected to cope with that sort of situation. And I know she's had to be very reliant, because then she's a single mum with 4 children at the time, on the widow's allowance. And yeah, I honestly don't know how she's managed to cope with that at all. But again, as far as I'm aware, she had to take obviously a lot of time off of work, sick leave, had to change departments and things. But I don't think was ever given any sort of formal support in terms of mental health and dealing with that sort of situation. And it is very reliant. She said the medical director at the time was fantastic and did speak to her and was just amazing support. But if he'd been a different individual, if he hadn't have been a kind, caring person, then I'm pretty sure she would have had an even more of a challenge adjusting to that situation, which obviously that's the only thing you can do in that situation, is adjust and try and move on eventually. So I know of that case, a lot of the people I work with don't come from particularly affluent backgrounds. Most of my colleagues have young children, and they'll be looking through Facebook Marketplace or eBay or something, looking for a deal. Like, nurses do tend to live on the breadline, and technicians, again, tend to live on the breadline. I know a lot of people that I work with want to take early retirement or some form of retirement, or will be counting down basically until they can retire. And I know that is not uncommon. Most people think, oh, I've just started work. When can I retire? Retirement seems nice. Because we're looking at our grandparents' generation, and they're like, what's the word? Something or other, defined benefit pension schemes and things, which we're never going to see. Like, we're going to have to work until we're 140, I'm pretty sure, before we can even access half of our pensions. And the NHS has a good pension by comparison to anybody who's to pay into a private pension or anybody who's to sort their own pension out. But it's still rubbish compared to what it used to be, or I don't know if you can say what it should be or anything like that. But a lot of people who say came over from Europe when that was still an option. I work with a lot of Eastern European nurses and nurses from the Philippines and stuff. So they've had to stop working as a nurse, come over to the UK to build a better life, restart at whatever age they moved over. So actually they have tiny pensions and they can't retire on their current pensions because they don't have enough money, despite the fact they've actually been working as a nurse for years and years and years. So it is quite ridiculous.
Pensions in general, wages in general have just stagnated over the last 30, 40 years anyway, with regard, in contrast to things like the cost of living, like the cost of housing. And especially with our sort of generation, who a lot of us have, were told to go to university and have ended up saddled with debt and stuff, and
Yeah.
yeah, so it is particularly again, I don't want to I want to try not to inject my own personal biases and sort of things into this, but it just is hard not to identify the same trends everywhere, when it comes to okay, wages are still going down, even when it comes to, the lives of even the people who are looking after us, who are saving our lives. We're still not looking after them. We're just empty gesturing with flags and clapping and stuff, and as soon as you try to criticize that, you get shouted down as some kind of millennial snowflake, and
even when you work in the NHS, you criticise, it's like, well, then you're not part of the cause. You're here, have a what did a colleague of mine say? She was saying, so she's a former doctor who's left the NHS, and she said she just couldn't take, okay, you're going to have to do more hours, you're going to have to do more work, you're going to have to do the paperwork as well, you're going to have to do all these different things. Oh, you've got burnout. Oh, okay. Well, here's a presentation. Here's an afternoon with someone, a motivational speaker, talking to you about resilience. Off you go. Do more. And it's just, I think her physical health suffered in the end.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. It's just like, okay, well, do more, get paid less. And if you're struggling, then clearly you just need a talk on resilience and how to push through, basically.
Oh my God,
is what you get told. And then when you complain, or if anybody raises it, then you're made to feel as if you're not a party pooper, but not part of the cause, or not fighting the good fight, it is just ridiculous. In my job, I know of people who have spoken up and been pushed aside and pretty much gaslighted. I know of senior members of staff who've tried to stick up for people who are on the front line or doing their job, or all sorts of things, and then they've ended up being gaslighted and pushed out, and because they're not towing the party line.
And that ties back into what we were talking about before about, people are in the NHS because they really care about the healthcare profession and saving lives and the institution of the NHS, with a free at the point of delivery health service. And there's this weird sort of weird dynamic where, because you care and you're so passionate about it, you're in the end punished for it, because your passion and your goodwill is taken advantage of. And as soon as you complain about that, suddenly you'll accuse you of not caring about the NHS. It's just such a weird double think. What would you call it? Sort of cognitive dissonance held there. Please work harder.
Yeah, definitely.
Give us more and more. Keep giving us more because we know you love it. Oh wait, you're not going to work your fingers to the bone, and you're not sleeping, and you're not. Oh well, I guess you just don't care hard enough. It kind of ties into the general sort of bootstrapping narratives that have sort of, again, I'm tying this back into politics again. I'm sorry, but it's
it's all right. It's linked.
These things don't exist in isolation, the whole sort of bootstrapping narratives we've had over the last, as I say, since the 80s, really, whereby, if you're not doing well, that sounds like a you problem. You're clearly not working hard enough or taking personal responsibility. And he's American because he's Ben Shapiro. Sorry. No,
100%. Yeah.
I think we can all agree that personal responsibility and working hard are virtuous qualities. The problem is that people are not seeing the fruits of that hard work, and so much wealth is concentrated in a tiny proportion of the population. I'm not talking about income, I'm talking about wealth.
Money that pay their taxes.
Money that just makes money for people, and it's intergenerational. It sits within the same families, the same circles of society, and this idea. And you do get these amazing stories of people starting from the bottom and rising, building their own businesses, and the sort of rags to riches thing. But that's such a isolated incidence. Most people's income mobility is quite poor, really, and actually unstable. And it's all down to the material conditions you're brought into. And when it comes to something like the NHS, which is paid for out of the public purse at time of recording,
Yeah.
I'm loath to, sort of speculate on the inner machinations of the minds of the people in government, but they, it's there in black and white in the books that they publish, is that they don't like the NHS. They don't like the institution of a publicly funded health service because it doesn't fit into at least the philosophy they present in those books, whereby that no, if you provide things for free, people will just take advantage. It's this, people will be lazy and irresponsible. It's this same old Malthusian sort of philosophy, which is detached from reality. That sort of philosophy came about because in a sort of era hundreds of years ago where the ability to produce food and the things that people need to survive were more scarce. They took longer. They required more hours of work. Now we can produce everything we need very, very efficiently, and there's more than enough to go around. But we still cling on to the idea that, oh, well, no, we can't possibly provide, we have to keep wealth concentrated in these higher up because they're the ones that worked hard for it, while also being funded by hedge funders and bankers and financiers and property moguls, whose job is literally just owning something and not actually providing a material benefit to the world in form of actual skilled labor of any kind.
Yeah, 100%. And the NHS is made up of people. And okay, you get the story of this person or the story of that person, but everyone has a story. You lose the individual. You're looking at an individual when you're looking at Boris Johnson standing outside of number 10 Downing Street. And the right-wing politicians are doing such a great job, and they have a really difficult time of things. And a lot of the people I work with who are from lower incomes and from working class backgrounds support the right wing politics, which just baffles me. I was having this conversation with one of the nurses I worked with the other week, but she was saying she doesn't get it, how people can object to Bob down the road making, who was on the dole, making a few extra bob on the side. So that can't be tolerated. That can't happen. But Boris Johnson can redo his house or have a renovation or extension or whatever it was and spend lots of money. And they go, oh, well, it's okay. Like he's done a good job. He deserves it. Like, what? What?
I love people who think that this government have handled the pandemic well. It's like... I think, again, it ties into the nationalism thing. It's like, Britain is the greatest country in the world. We couldn't have possibly done any better. This is the best we could do. If you disagree, then you should just leave. I'm just like, it's just the worst cognitive dissonance. I mean, I've been studying a lot about why some working class people end up voting Tory. And there's a couple of reasons. I know we're drifting away from NHS, but it's all linked. But
it is. This is interesting. Go on, continue.
Because the concept of what the idea of what constitutes the working class keeps changing, because we are now at a point, right? Now, this is obviously ties into why Labour keeps losing elections, right? And there's a grain of truth to this, in that for somehow someone in their mid-20s or 30s, millennials essentially, who are scraping by on minimum wage, who are told to, if you can work hard and, set your sights, you can achieve anything. Go get yourself a degree, go skill up, go crush the competition with your education and your skills. And, 10 years later, it's still working a minimum wage job. That, for some reason, is the metropolitan out-of-touch elite. But a 50, 60-year-old baby boomer that's paid off their mortgage, has a comfortable pension package and got their education for free, that's the working class. It's completely baffling to me. And they continue propagating this sort of culture war narrative whereby, oh, all the millennials, they're all Marxists and they want to take away your they want to take away your property and they want to tax you into oblivion. They want to destroy Western civilization. It's obviously all nonsense, because the whole point is that they want these older generation people to forget that they actually, even though obviously technology has obviously come a long way since, for example, the 80s, the material conditions that they grew up in many ways were superior. You know, they had much more reasonable house prices. A lot of them could buy their council houses. Wages rose with productivity, things like that. They got their education for free. You know, there were so many material conditions that they had benefits of, which we don't get now. You know, technology is always improving. You know, we've got smartphones, you know, we've got Netflix, we've got, you know, Fortnite and whatever. We've got all these other things. But what we don't have is job security. We don't have housing security. You know, we don't have a lot of things that the baby boomer generation, for example, take for granted. And so the Conservatives, for example, which exist just to win elections, let's be fair, it is in their interest to propagate this culture war, because dividing the working class means that they won't all vote the same. So instead they have to dream up this imaginary leftist boogeyman that's trying to destroy the West, despite the fact that the millennials, for example, you know, we have obviously got the highest university attendance in history. And so we're the best educated. You know, we've gone out, we've read lots of different perspectives on things. You know, we've dedicated our lives to it. You know, we've invested in it. We've actually forked out for it. And yet we're still demonized as this some kind of lazy, irresponsible, blah, blah, blah. When actually we've been handed a shit sandwich by a system that still favors the generations two behind. And, you know, being working class isn't about what accent you've got. It isn't about the way you dress. It isn't about your taste in music. It isn't about which part of the country you live in. Although they like to propagate that's the way it is, and that's the way they sell it. What makes you working class is your and then this is where the theory is coming in. It's about your relationship to the means of production. Do you make a living by actually performing a skill, making a product, actually delivering a service? Is that how you make a living? Or do you just make a living from owning things? Do you just buy up property and rent it out and get other people to pay your mortgage? Do you just move money around and expect different currency shifts to pay your way? Do you actually have assets and wealth that pay for you rather than actually performing a skill? And that is why, you know, you get these this weird double think, as you went on about, where they're quite happy for Boris to sponge off the public purse in paying for his apartment, and, you know, siphoning off billions of public funds to his cronies for useless contracts that don't help anybody, but they will happily vilify what's his face down the road for maybe taking a little bit more out of the public purse than he should have just to feed his children. That's the, you know, it's about the deserving and undeserving poor, you know. It's back to that really reductive argument. Oh, you just didn't bootstrap hard enough. You didn't take a responsibility. It's like that sort of hyper individualism where you sort of ignore everybody's material conditions, which actually leads to the death of the individual, because that person can't pursue their interests if they're constantly crushed by stagnating wages. You know, that person can't, you know, contribute and achieve their potential if there's constantly a glass ceiling over their heads. Even after they've spent... Sorry, go on. Your turn. I've ranted long enough.
No, it's fine. No, I was going to say to actually add to that. So you asked earlier whether about if I knew any colleagues on food banks and that kind of thing. And my comments are still the same. Nobody has spoken to me. A big company, and he says a lot of the people above him will move around every 6 months. So he'll be the most senior person on the job, or the most experienced, not senior. There'll be people more senior than him, but he'll be the most experienced, and he'll be explaining to senior managers why or how a job works. And he's thinking, well, why? And my dad said, well, yeah, because then they can charge more. if the people high up don't understand, they can blame it on the people who do understand below them. And then, you know, it takes them longer to understand a job. So the person providing the company can charge the client more. So that's what they do. And it looks great for them because they've got all this flow of people between different departments and things, and upward mobility, inverted commas, and what have you. But however, my partner works for, they say to their employees, can you volunteer to make our company look good? And Matt likes volunteering, so Matt was like, yeah, sure, particularly during the pandemic, great. So first of all, it took them quite a long time to actually mobilise. So I think he volunteered for 2 shifts in the end, when I think he'd put his name down right at the beginning. And it was packing for food banks. And he said it was the most humbling experience he has ever had, because he turned up at this food bank and there was nothing. They were told, like, okay, here's your box. You have to go around a bit like Tesco's. What's the word? When people pick and pack, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah,
Here's your
yeah.
list. Yeah, he said there was nothing. It would be like, okay, so you've got a family of 7 here, and they need this many calories, so you're going to make that up in cereal bars. And here's a few bits of bread or something. And he said there was just nothing for these families that were then going to have to survive off of, I think it was supposed to be a week's worth of food. And it was all just sort of making up calories with calorie replacement things, or if they had actually in this case, but also in cases of so I'm while I'm working, I'm training to be a genetic counsellor again in the NHS, but at least it's a profession that's slightly more autonomous. But through that training, I've come across people with genetic conditions who've had to shield and have not been able to leave the house, and have dietary requirements because of their conditions, and they haven't been able to get the right food because they've had to rely on it being delivered. And because consumers will buy up everything, certainly initially, they were getting really ill because they couldn't access the right food that wouldn't make them sick, because they needed like gluten-free products, or they needed ketone diets and things like that, but for medical reasons rather than because, you know, quinoa might run out, all that kind of thing. So it's yeah, it's an interesting world in which we live when yeah, making up calories with cereal bars and having to eat products that you don't actually physically have a way of getting any alternative, but what you're having is going to make you sick. It's like your flags.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Open your can of beans, eat the flags and die.
Yeah, it's all right. That's all we've got for you. If you wanted something better, you should have just worked harder.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, oh, you shouldn't have been born with a genetic problem.
Yeah, exactly.
uh,
Yeah. Or you should have got,
and
you'd gotten health insurance. That sounds like a you problem.
yeah, exactly. Well, here's something for a you problem, and this again, I know to be, this happened in my department, so I know it to be a true thing.
Yeah.
But a colleague of mine has 2 young children, like very young. One of them is deaf, so he has hearing aids, which enable him to hear a bit, but not fully. And I think he's about 6 years old, so he's able to compensate fairly well, but he does have a significant disability. And then she has a daughter who was, when she was born, they thought she had dwarfism, or she was going to have dwarfism. She doesn't appear to have dwarfism, but she does have some sort of condition that affects her lungs and her heart. And I think she has had heart surgery from a young age. And certainly, I think she's maybe 3 or 4 years old, but from a young age, she had to have thickened liquids because there must be some sort of problem with her lungs in that she'll aspirate any liquids or food that isn't that has any sort of liquid component that can go into her lungs, and obviously that will then cause bacteria to grow, and she gets very, very ill. And they don't know the exact cause, but there's clearly something that's not quite right with her development, or at least her respiratory pathways when they've been developed. And this colleague, which makes her daughter incredibly clinically vulnerable. As you can imagine, if her daughter got COVID, she very much fall under a category where my colleague could face losing her daughter. And she was told to work through COVID. And I know we've seen all these lovely stories of, people who've given up everything and haven't seen their family for 6 months or a year or whatever, because they've been living in hotels and they haven't wanted to infect their family. But so this is what my trust told my colleague was, you have to come into work, or you have to take it as all of your holiday, all of your sick leave, so that you can shield your daughter.
Oh my God.
Because you're not the one affected. Yeah. And she said, right, well then I'm taking all of my holiday, I'm taking all of my sick leave. And her daughter genuinely shielded for about a year. Yeah, pretty much a year. And she did end up coming back once the vaccines were, actually I think she came back before the vaccines, but it was up to us as a department to make sure that she didn't have to come into contact with patients, that she could man the phones and things. And she'd said, I will work from home. Give me a trust computer, give me Rota, give me anything I can do from home. And they said, no, you have to come in and work on the wards, or at least in the department. And she just said, no, so it's her and her partner, but again, they're not flush with cash. So it was a case of, if I have to leave my job so that my daughter doesn't get COVID, I will. But then what situation does that leave her in if she then can't feed her family, or, has to scrape together money for rent because it's a 2-income household? Like, that level of pressure and stress is insane when you're thinking about a 3-year-old who, if they were to catch COVID, would more than likely die. It's just insane that she was then forced to make that decision.
Yeah, that's completely backwards. Like, it's completely backwards. Like, good God, lots of love go out to that family. Jesus.
Yeah. And they're fine now. So luckily she was able to stay in the job, and we all supported her in making sure that, she only worked when she needed to and could spend like next to no time with patients. But when your people who are supposed to be protecting you say, well, all of these people are doing this thing, she's like, yeah, well, all of these people don't have a really young, vulnerable family.
Yeah,
and maybe
exactly.
they do, but that's their choice. I don't want to make that choice.
Yeah, but yeah, I really appreciate you coming on to talk to me and sharing your experience with me. As I say, it's really important, I think, to speak to the other people. One of the things that has left our society with such really bad ideas of the world and people's scenarios, that we are so alienated from the actual people on the ground doing the work, as well as from the actual products we buy, and the services we receive, looking at things through a screen. Even pre-technology was sort of, as I say, not only are workers sort of alienated from the sort of the reasons they're doing it, the decisions that have been made, the people that also receive those services are alienated from the experiences of the people providing that service, which is particularly egregious when it comes to life and death in healthcare. So yeah, I really appreciate all your insight and your stories on there. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. You're very welcome.